Hello, right, let's make a start. Welcome to this webinar on the Building Safety Act from the Federation of Master Builders. My name's Hayley, I'm Director of Membership at the FMB, and whether this is the first FMB event that you've attended or you're a webinar veteran, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to join us this afternoon, and you're very welcome. This webinar series is sponsored by Hazard Co. Hazard Co's technology helps you to manage health and safety on site in a simple and efficient way. That's during the construction phase of the project, and we're very grateful to have their support for this series of webinars. However, I do want to flag up at this early stage that the Building Safety Act is not about how you manage health and safety on site. It's about the safety of the resulting building for the years and decades after the end of the building project. So it's important that we make that distinction very clear, because we wouldn't want anybody to go away from this webinar with a misunderstanding about that. And I'm sure that Mark will cover that in the presentation as well. So one of the things that we do at the FMB is bring you, hopefully, lots of essential information to help you in running your business. And I think in the more than 20 years that I've worked in this industry at the FMB, I don't think there's been a more important piece of information or legislation for our members to be aware of than this one. Our speakers today are from Cube Construction Consultants, who are well versed in this subject already and have been delivering training for other organisations around the UK, including for the CIOB. So we know that you're in good hands today. And today's is the first in a series of 5 webinars as well. So we're not covering everything to do with the Building Safety Act in this first session, but FMB members will be able to view recordings of any of the 5 webinars via the FMB members area of the website after they've been delivered. And that's not a time limited thing. So they'll be on the website for as long as they're useful to our members, which I suspect will be a very long time. So don't worry if you miss any of these sessions, you'll be able to view the recordings afterwards. And we will send you a follow-up email, which will have a link to that recording as well. If a question occurs to you during the session, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box down there. You can type your questions in there. And we'll try and deal with as many of those as possible at the end of the session. The webinar itself should last for about an hour. That's about 45 minutes of presentation slides, I think, and then Q&A session after that. And don't forget that a question might occur to you that's actually going to be covered in one of the subsequent sessions. So we won't be able to cover everything today. So I think that's all of the housekeeping information from me. So I'm going to turn my camera off and hand over to Mark Johnston from Cube Construction Consultants. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Hayley. So welcome, everybody. I'm just going to share now with you the presentation. As Hayley has summed up there, the Building Safety Act is a huge topic, and our approach is to take sensible bites out of the whole information pack and present it over a number of 5 webinars. We progressed through the Building Safety Act, and I think it's fair to say the first 3 are relative to everybody in the industry. There's then more detail led into webinars 4 and 5, which relate specifically to the HRB process and that additional level of information that's required to comply with any interaction with HRBs, including the increased responsibilities as duty holders. So some of those terms may not be overly familiar to you at the moment, but as we work through, they will become apparent. So just a little bit about Cube first, understand who we are and why we're here. Well, Cube are a CIOB chartered construction management consultancy. That's something we're very proud of. It's quite a high bar to achieve. And what that means is we are deemed to have demonstrated a level of knowledge and understanding in the industry, which is compatible with the requirements and ethics for the CIOB. So we've been in business now, myself and Nicola, for almost 5 years. And the key services we provide are independent project reviews, process improvements for SMEs through to regional contractors. And we've also designed a construction management software, which is aimed at achieving successful outcomes on projects by recording information and sharing actions through an automatic system. So we like to think we understand the complexities of construction projects. You know, we have direct experience of delivering any number of projects of different value in different sectors, and we have dealt directly with all end users, clients, and professional teams in between. Part of what we do is we like to think that we can provide clarity to the construction process, and in particular process on site and the way the companies operate. To do that, it's really based on best practice. And when we're dealing with best practice, it's very hard to talk about and implement best practice if you do not recognise the Building Safety Act. So with the ascendancy of the Building Safety Act, it's become a key part of what we do and how we work. As part of that extended knowledge over the last year, as Hayley said, we've been working with the CIOB and other institutions to create training content which will go into greater detail on particular elements of the Building Safety Act. And we are using that content to be able to have these webinars with you starting today. So this is webinar number 1, just to give you an outline of the content. I guess this is a relatively easy introduction. What we want to do is be able to understand why we have the Act. We're going to look at some objectives, assuming your attendance through the webinar series. There is a knowledge check. Now, we won't be doing the knowledge check every week. If anything, we'd like it to be a line in the sand today so that you can check where you are with your knowledge. And it's a private thing. We will ask some questions. We'd like you to make note of any answers you believe to be correct or information that you think is relevant. And as you work through the webinars, you know, let's use them as a reference point for discussion. As we go through, you will then become aware of the information and the answers. Check on them as we work through, mark your progress, and if we need to use them as a discussion point, then please do. We then talk about what is the Building Safety Act. And then finally, to sum up webinar number 1, we will be looking at competence. And for reasons that will become apparent, competence is a really central part of the Building Safety Act. And since we started doing training, I can honestly say that at the end of every session, it doesn't matter whether we are delivering training to tier 1 contractors, regional contractors, or domestic build. They could be architects, engineers, or contractors. Everybody is left with the central issue of competence. And that's because it affects all of us under the Building Safety Act. So why do we have the Building Safety Act? Well, it's very relevant at the moment. Only last week, report number 2 came out from the Grenfell inquiry. And of course, I'm sure everybody will remember the Grenfell disaster where 72 residents lost their lives. It was the worst UK residential fire for over 100 years. That was a marking time where there needed to be change. As a result of that feeling within the industry and government intervention, we then had the Grenfell inquiry. Now, we'll probably just focus on the top two sections here, and I'm going to read this out because it's particularly important. It's materials that were selected and changed showed a blatant disregard for what could happen. Now, what that means is that through the construction process of Grenfell, there was opportunities for products manufacturers, for architects, for contractors to be able to change the approved design. They did so based on information that wasn't properly scrutinised. They didn't consider the relationship of change. So, for example, if you were to change the cladding system, how would that affect the cavity fire barriers? How would that affect the interaction on the reveals with the windows? Was there certification for the new materials to be tested to prove that they could reach the necessary fire standards? There were any number of errors, and when we think about that scenario alone and you go through the Building Safety Act, just keep that first line in mind and you will get a deeper understanding of why we have the Act in its current format. It's very much about responsibility, accountability, competence, and change. So if we change anything, how is that recorded? Now, on the back of the inquiry, it was deemed absolutely essential that the industry now work to implement a robust and assured approach. And that's because we are building increasingly complex structures, some of which people live in. So we've then got a direct relationship with Grenfell, haven't we? It's about the safety of the residents. In 2021, the Building Safety Act was introduced to Parliament and received royal assent on the 28th of April 2022. So, what do we want to achieve by attending the webinars? Well, we hope for you to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the Building Safety Act, which is referenced as the BSA. We'd like you then to share that awareness with colleagues, clients, consultants, and contractors. We'd like you to be able to define a HRB. So let's understand what that is. It's a high-risk building, but how do you meet the criteria for a high-risk building? And just whilst we're on the point, let's just be clear that a HRB is high risk. There's been any number of explanations in the past. We've had the weird and wonderful, high residential, any number of combination of words. The accurate definition is a high-risk building. We'd like to have a reference point to relevant legislation and sources of further information. Understand the roles, responsibilities of duty holders and how this relates to our ongoing operations. So what are our defined duties? How do we understand them? And more importantly, what are other duty holders' responsibilities? That allows you to draw the boundaries between yourselves as a contractor or principal designer or principal contractor and client. We want to identify the responsibilities of the accountable persons, which is a new role. Understand the implications of the Building Safety Act during construction phase, and that's in two parts. That's for all works, so all general works, and then HRBs. We'd like to be able to understand the importance and relevance of keeping digital records, which are there to track change, and understand the responsibilities of the golden thread of evidence. Now, there are certain elements within those objectives which relate directly to HRBs, but essentially the majority relate to all works. And that's something we will explain as we go through. So we're just going to spend a few minutes on this. We don't need you to share immediate answers. Please just make a note, put them in your book, keep them to one side. And as we work through the webinars, the answers will become apparent, or as I say, we'd welcome any questions regarding these particular topics. So question number 1. What buildings are covered under the Building Safety Act? Number 2, name 3 duty holders. Number 3, how does the Building Safety Act have an impact on change management? Question 4, the Building Safety Act only deals with high-rise fire safety. True or false? Question 5, is occupational health covered by the provision of the Building Safety Act? Six, which building control body manages the HRB process? Seven, what's the main objective of the Building Safety Act? Eight, Building Safety Act provision identifies competency guidelines for who? Nine, how would you define the content of the golden thread of information? And finally, question 10, under the Building Safety Act, what do construction operational staff now have a legal obligation to do on all projects? Now, as I say, don't worry if you're not able to answer all 10 questions straight away. That's the point of what we're doing. We will work through these topics, but it's nice to get a baseline of information that you can then later reflect on as we progress through the webinars. So let's talk about what is the Building Safety Act. Well, there's one central mission within the Building Safety Act, and that's to ensure that people are safer and feel safer in their homes, schools, and workplaces. So when we go back to Grenfell and we talk about the reason for change, you can see why the central mission within the Building Safety Act is geared towards the safe occupation of buildings and the ongoing responsibility for those occupants. We need to create a safe building, which is then managed safely and makes people feel safer in their homes, schools, and workplaces. So that's a fairly significant change for us, not so much in process, but more about culture. I think there's quite a few people in the industry that will need to change their mindset and be able to accept that we need to improve the way that we are designing and constructing and in fact managing buildings which are then occupied. When we look at the central mission, there's probably 5 key objectives to focus on, and they are identified as follows. So the first one is the safety and standards of buildings. So what are our expectations? What are the standards? And how do we regulate the safety standards? Secondly, we need to assure the safety of HRBs. Now, it's a common misconception that the Building Safety Act only applies to high-rise residential. The Building Safety Act applies to all building works, but in specifically with HRBs, the Building Safety Act is retrospective. So it covers all existing stock, all new stock, and includes for the refurbishment, maintenance, and occupation of HRBs. So this is an all-encompassing. So we can apply the Act and look back at defective work. We can apply the Act to an existing HRB. We can apply the Act to a new HRB which is being designed and constructed, and we apply it to those buildings that are in occupation if they include residential units, 2 or more residential units. The fundamental part of the Act is to improve the competency of people responsible for overseeing, managing and delivering the works. So that's all building works. There is then a secondary expectation for those working on HRBs. We need to ensure clear legislation and guidance. So we have the Act. How are people understanding that? Do they understand the legislation and those responsible? And probably most importantly, it needs to put residents at the heart of a new system of building safety. So why are we doing this? What's the objective? Well, a building will be occupied, and our objective is to create a safe space where people can live, and that building is maintained to assure their safety. So we'll quickly look at what's covered and what's not covered under the Building Safety Act. The Building Safety Act has a focus on the construction industry providing buildings that are safe to those who occupy them. Again, it's about making people feel safe and be safe in their homes, schools and residences. There is, however, a misconception that the Building Safety Act only applies to high-risk or high-rise buildings. We are still meeting people on training courses on various organisations who believe they are exempt in many ways from the Building Safety Act because they don't do residential work or they don't do high-rise buildings. So there's a very simple rule for this. That assumption is incorrect. It applies to all building work covered by building regulations with only a few exceptions. So if you are ever in doubt about the general application of the Building Safety Act, please use this as your reference point. If the works are covered by building regulations, then the Building Safety Act applies. There are only a few minor exemptions to that, one of them being Ministry of Defence, because the Ministry of Defence have a different playbook when it comes to the development of projects on private lands, which is owned by the state effectively. So pretty much every scenario of projects is covered by the Building Safety Act. It's there to cover the design and construction of new build and residential conversions. It covers the management and safety of HRB buildings once occupied. So we've completed the project, we've received the appropriate certification, and now the Act applies during the occupation phase. It also applies to remediation of historic defects which could make the building unsafe. And put simply, I think every now and then you will see on the news about the progress of cladding remediation. across the country. I think the latest count was that there was approximately 25 or 35% of the works which were either underway or complete. So there's still a huge sector of work there which requires remediation. Interestingly, there have been a number of legal cases where developers have been taken to court and found responsible for defective historic works. They have then been fined considerable sums, and that money is helping to pay for remediation works. There's a central government fund, but still a lot of work to do. What's not covered under the Act is site safety process and procedures and occupational health. So I think everybody will be aware of CDM. You know, it's been part of our construction lives now for almost 10 years in general building works. Everything that you know about CDM continues to be the same. The Building Safety Act does not cross over with CDM. It runs in, my explanation is it runs in parallel. So everything you do with CDM regarding site safety and occupational health remains under the remit of the HSE and CDM guidance.
Can I just add something at this point? We've had a comment from Gordon Nelson, who's the FMB Scotland director, and just wanted us to reference, in case there's any Scottish-based members present, that the Building Safety Act does not generally apply in Scotland. And it's probably worthwhile as mentioning that early on rather than getting to the end. What he has said is that in his role, he engages with the Building Standards Division in Scotland. He can assist with any queries from any Scotland members on relevant aspects, and the General Direction of Track Building Standards and Compliance for Scotland.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a good point. The devolved nations are at different stages of progress with this. I mean, I think it's generally accepted that I think the Welsh version, if you like, for want of a better word, will be pretty much an exact copy of the existing Act. I think Northern Ireland, there are some ongoing discussions, but it's believed that the majority of the Acts will be transferred wherever possible used, although Scotland specifically will have amendments to fit with its current legislation and operating ways. So there's two words here that will come across time and time again, and that's competency and compliance. A key area of the Building Safety Act is to address the competence of the individuals carrying out the design, construction and refurbishment work. It is an obligation for us now to formally record and report and prove our competence, either as individuals or organisations. If it is the competency of an organisation, then this includes the appropriate management systems, process, policies and resources that we have in place to operate as a competent organisation. It's a legal requirement to ensure individuals and organisations meet these requirements. Now, historically, we would look at competency as perhaps even starting with a CSCS card. You know, on the major contractors group signed up to the CSCS cards, what, 2001, 2002, and it's been a baseline of role-specific competency on projects. We also have role and specific training. So that could be that, you know, as a site manager, I've had first aid at work and I've done my triple STS. It could be that I've got occupational competence. So I've done a degree in construction management, or I've done a HND in building surveying. Whatever the formal training is, we've tended to look at competency in very narrow terms. What the Act now identifies is that as an individual or an organisation, we need to prove competence, and that means competence is considered as possessing the appropriate skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And it mandates that all individuals engaged in design, construction, and refurbishment and maintenance work must demonstrate competence in their respective roles. And this is a really key point. This is not about everybody proving they can build a 10-storey steel frame residential unit in a city centre. Competence is relative and only relevant to the works for which you are engaged to do. So I'm going to use an extreme example, but if I run a business and I build 6 bungalows every year, then I need to demonstrate I'm competent as an individual and an organisation to continue to do that kind of work. If I was then asked to go and build a steel frame reinforced concrete cinema in a town centre, then I wouldn't have the necessary competencies and experience to demonstrate that I am competent to do so. And this is where we see the distinction with individual competency and organisational competency. So with individuals, you need to possess the skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours for your role. Now, part of that you can do through recognised assessment. So ongoing CPD, it could be a formal course. It could be exposure to an external company assessing your competencies. But fundamentally, individuals must only undertake work within the limits of their competency and capacity. So if I'm the guy building 6 bungalows a year and I get a request to build a £15 million cinema, I have an obligation to identify that I do not have the competencies to do that work. Now, that doesn't mean you can't progress. It doesn't mean that you are then forever stuck building bungalows. What it means is that you need to demonstrate that you are acquiring those skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours to be able to progress and do other works. From an organisation's point of view, they need to demonstrate and evidence their capability and their supply chain's capability. So if I'm a main contractor, are my subcontractors competent? How do I know they're competent to do the works for which I am engaging them to do? That will include then demonstrating to me that they've got the suitable support, management and supervision, along with the appropriate resource to ensure that they get competent outcomes. Now, every business is different. We recognise that. We're all of different scale, with different aspirations, different clients and different end products. However, it may be that you do not have an admin department or you don't do design, but it's really nice to be aware of how the Act can affect the role of either your colleagues or associates. So because of the Act, there's an increased responsibility to ensure that we've got clear access to digital records regarding training, competency, documentation in the build process. Now, for some operations, that might mean an increase in burden on administration. How do we deal with that? How do we store that information? Who's responsible? From an operational point of view, it's probably fair to say that a great deal of the Act doesn't mean wholesale change. So again, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking, the world's gone mad, we're reinventing the wheel. The Act doesn't want that. It doesn't ask you to do that. It's really just a case of Formalize best practice, do what you should be doing, and recognise that you've now got a legal obligation to do certain parts of that. We've talked about how there's stricter guidance on competency and proof of competency. And anybody involved in the construction process will have to have access to up-to-date documentation, training certification, proof of skills, the things that contribute to competence. From a design point of view, there is now a shift in focus on design. It's about capturing the right design information, which is approved and then built to. If there is a change in design, then there are specific rules that apply to change control. And to summarise, what that means is if there is a change, there needs to be a full audit trail to record that change and understand why that change occurred and what the end result was. Now, for designers, that might mean a shift in responsibility, because ultimately, one of the duty holders is to be the principal designer. And we'll cover that off later, but that can be a slightly confusing topic to go through, so I won't go too far at the moment. Managers have got the responsibility and in some cases legal duty to maintain a management system that ensures operational process, including documentation management, are adhered to. So as part of our competence as an organisation, what processes and procedures do we have? What documentation do we need to record? Who is responsible for capturing that information? How are we as a company demonstrating we are competent to do that? If you engage with any consultants or employ third-party consultants, they're also required to prove their competence. So you will need personal documentation of qualifications and skills from those third-party consultants, and you will generally need that before they become active on a project. So it could be a structural engineer, it could be a fire engineer. Before I engage with them and therefore rely on their advice and potential design content, have I understood that they are competent and have they provided me with the information to prove their competence? And of course, as ever, the buck stops with the directors. If you are a director, you need to understand the impact on the regulations or of the regulations to your organisation and drive the cultural change. So, brief summary of everything we've been through. The Building Safety Act received royal assent in April 2022. It places a legal duty on all those in construction to ensure that the building's safety can be assured. So, again, it's not a reinvention of the wheel, but there's now a legal duty on those that participate in the construction process to ensure that the building is safe to be occupied. The law gives reassurance and confidence to building occupants and users who can feel safer and are safe in their dwellings, homes and schools and workplaces. And this goes back to the point that Hayley made right at the introduction. The focus of the Act is on the safety of buildings rather than the process of building safely. And that's really, really important that as we progress through these webinars, you hold that thought. You understand that this is not about the process of building safely. It is about the safety of the building. How do we demonstrate we have built a building which complies with the approved regulations? So when we talk about compliance, we're talking about having a design which is proven to meet building regs, which is approved by the relevant people, and then constructed or designed by competent people who can guarantee that the end product will be compliant with building regs. The Building Safety Act will impact nearly everyone in construction, and it should. There are very few people in the industry which are not touched by the Building Safety Act, and that is through all of the industry, from tier ones all the way down to the domestic work and everything in between. The Act is not a reinvention of the construction process. Most of the legislation is nothing new, and we should understand that we just now have a legal duty to comply. So we are not reinventing the wheel. You know, much of the process that you will have to deal with will remain aligned with local building control, approved inspectors. The process for that remains the same. The approval process and design responsibilities remain the same, but the Act identifies duty holders, and those duty holders have a legal obligation to comply with the Act. And the duties for each role are clearly set out, and we will come to those in webinar 3. So like I say, today's quite an easy introduction. We've looked at who we are as Q, why we have the Act, what the objectives of the webinars are, the knowledge check, what is the Building Safety Act, and we've given a light touch into competency. What we want to do then is build on that information, that knowledge, and when we meet this time next week, we'll be looking at the key legislation, the principal designer role, consequences, what does this mean for us, and the definition of a HRB. So we'll be building on the knowledge and we're relating it to specific roles and responsibilities. I think we are in a position now where if anybody has a question, we can open up the meeting. Happy to skip back through slides if there's anything specifically you want to address. Probably the next time we meet, there's a little bit more to go through, so the pace might be a little bit quicker. But initially on webinar 1, you know, easy introduction. This is where we are. This is where we're going with it. Hopefully you've got some questions, and we look forward to answering those.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. That's been great. There's, as Mark's just said, if anybody does have a question in their minds, please type it in the Q&A box, and we can get Mark and Nicola to answer those. In the meantime, I have a question that I was thinking of. You may be going to cover this in one of the subsequent webinars, but as you mentioned, there's a lot in there about competence. And when I last heard this figure quoted from CITB, it was something like 60% of the workforce in the construction industry doesn't have a formal qualification. So there's a lot of people out there working who are qualified by experience and learning on the job rather than actually having a qualification to demonstrate their competence. So is that going to be a difficult thing? Is that going to mean that people are not able to demonstrate their competence if they don't have a piece of paper or a CSCS card or whatever?
No, I don't see that being a blocker. I think when you get a deeper understanding of competence, it's let's not forget, competence is built of skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. You know, behaviours is not something that you learn at college or university. That's, you know, that's your behaviour on site. That's your behaviour in the office. How do you interact with the process? What behaviours have you learned that bring value? Skills and knowledge, again, you could apply directly to your work history. So have I been a junior site manager? Do I now run a team of engineers on site? Am I a project manager? Do I run my own business? How have my roles and responsibilities changed? Am I responsible for dealing directly with design? Do I deal directly with subcontractors? Do I understand the technical interactions with building control? All of those elements are relative, and actually all of that gives you a much more rounded story of competence. It's not about having, you know, an NVQ6 or a CSCS. It's very much more rounded, in my view, to capturing and really using your experience to say, you know, I am a responsible person. I can deal with the supply chain. I'm well aware of the issues with waste. I'm able to have a technical conversation with the architect. We understand the necessary building regulations. There's any number of things that you can feed in. And that's really part of the conversation that we're having with the industry at the moment, is that there are only a few formal gateways to actually doing a course that then says you are an approved principal contractor. And at the moment, one of those is through the CIOB. But by definition, it's restrictive because you have to be a member to be able to do the course. So that then disqualifies probably 98% of the UK construction workforce who aren't members, yet still need to prove competence. And as I say, this is part of the conversation we're having with any number of people at the moment, is how they tailor their proof of competence relative to the works that they are doing or want to do. And that's really the main point. I don't have to prove that I can build 20-story residential buildings, because actually I build residential units and you know, industrial units. If that's my field, if that's what I do, that's what I need to prove competency in. And I think there's any number of ways you can do that.
We've had a few questions as well now from the members. We've got one question from Mark Gribbin, who said, does having historical projects demonstrate competency without any formal assessment? And I think you've sort of gone part way to explaining that. Formal assessment is always going to be really useful for demonstrating competency, but having historical projects that you can build upon and you can demonstrate goes part way, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a key part of competency is, you know, I think a lot of people would think, well, I'll just put my CV together and say, these are the jobs I've done, and that proves I can do another one. In some ways, you're part way there, but it needs more. And as a company, if you've got case studies which demonstrate the kind of work you've done, the challenges that you've faced, the challenges that you've overcome, the responsibilities that you've had, the training that you or team members have had, a development plan to say, you know, this is the training plan for next year. All of those pieces of the jigsaw contribute to it. Of course, a significant portion of that will be the works that are relative to you as a business that you've successfully completed. It has to be the starting point. You just need a little bit more around it.
And then Annie has said, will we be covering more on competency in next webinars? Straightforward answer to that is yes. It is a far-ranging topic, and there's a lot of work being undertaken at the moment by the CLC to define competence. As SMEs, do we need to be thinking more about CPD for our teams, which is something we're not used to be doing in the industry? And again, I would say the simple answer to that is yes. It is part of the Act, is to improve the competency of the people working in the industry generally. The fact that you're attending this webinar in the first place is a demonstration that it's important to you to keep up to date with what's happening out there in this sector. But yes, definitely looking at training plans for your teams and regular CPDs is a really good way to be starting. And then we've had another.
I just want to add to that. Let's not forget at this point that competency is valid if it is assessed. That's the benchmark. Excuse me.
So I suppose that comes back to Mark's question. Does having historical projects demonstrate competence if you've had no formal assessment?
No, but when you define a competency pack to say we are competent, you are doing it for somebody else to carry out the assessment.
Okay.
So, you know, it's if I'm a contractor, then by definition, I should be getting asked by the client if I'm competent to do this job. It is for them to assess our competency. I would then I would put my competency statement together with supporting evidence and information, training plans, CPD records, CVs, case studies, my company policies and procedures, my challenges, the challenges I've overcome, the way I operate. If you put that together as your competency pack, it is then being assessed by the client, and they are responsible for defining if you are competent for the works for which they wish to engage you on.
So
Mark,
we've,
isn't that slightly different though in relation to the domestic client? Because what framework are they going to have to use to assess whether that competency is what's needed or not? You know, they're not experienced in that, are they? So it's different.
It comes in the next webinar actually under legislation, and in there we'll identify how you progress through with the formal appointment of principal contractor and principal designer.
Yeah.
Now, in the domestic world, there is, in my understanding, a recognition that domestic clients will not be aware of the Building Safety Act. And the default position is then that you, as the lead contractor, by default become the principal contractor. So you are assuming those duties by default.
and those competencies then.
So you then have to have the competency to prove that you are able to fulfill that role.
Which
So
kind
it
of
is slightly different. It is slightly different in the pure domestic market.
And that kind of addresses the next question, doesn't it, from the anonymous person who's asked, who do you prove the competence to? Is it only addressed when something's gone wrong? Because most small builders will ignore this unless it's enforced. I guess that's what you're speaking about.
I mean, you know, I think that's a fair statement. I honestly do. I think, you know, let's look at the market. If you go from the top, you've got tier one contractors who will be engaged in large projects where reputation is everything. They cannot afford to fail on this, and they will be 100% behind it. They'll have the resource, time, and capability to do it. You've then got regional contractors that will need to understand and demonstrate competency on any number of levels, because the level of jobs they are looking to deliver will include significant sums and risk to clients, and clients will be assessing the competency of those companies. But let's flip it the other way and say, well, okay, why would you not do this? Because as a company that wants to stand out from the crowd, even if I had a client that didn't understand the Building Safety Act, as part of my submission or bid to a client, I would be letting them know that actually I do understand this and I understand the legislation, which means I've looked after their risk. I am mitigating their risk and mine. And I've done that by providing you with this information. Yeah. That's to me is where people should be. It's not about, shall I only do it if I get caught? It's about what advantage do I get by showing that I'm competent with this. Yeah. And that's the first step to that, is attending these series of webinars, isn't it? So that people can, as you set out in the objectives, that's one of the aims of all of this, is that people come out at the end of it being able to understand and describe it to others, including their clients. Absolutely, yeah. You know, and clients aren't going to understand. You know, they might have seen something on the telly about Grenfell, but they won't understand what it means to them. But you know, I think it would be good for contractors in that market to be able to explain to a client that they are fully understanding of the Building Safety Act. They are playing their part, and as such, they're letting the client know what they've done as a competent contractor. We've got a few more questions in there still, haven't we? Are you okay to carry on having questions fired at you for a few more minutes, Mark? Yep. Nicola, do you want to?
Candy, we've got one from Jack, who says, if a principal contractor appointed a subcontractor with suitable competency to a project, is it accepted that the subcontractor is then responsible for ensuring the individual competency of their operatives? It would be very hard as a contractor to assess an operative's behaviour prior to them starting on site. Good question. Yeah, and you're right. If I'm a principal contractor on a job, I'm a duty holder, I have specific obligations.
if I were to employ you as a subcontractor, you would effectively become a contractor under the duty holder terms. As principal, it is my responsibility to appoint you as a competent contractor. You are responsible for the competency of your organisation and individuals, and that carries on down the supply chain.
Flows through.
So, what was his name? Sorry, Jack.
Jack, yeah.
So, Jack, if you employed, I don't know, an electrical subcontractor and you employed a specialist roofing contractor, you would be looking for them to prove a relative level of competence for the works for which you want to employ them, making them understand that they are responsible for the competency of their organisation and individuals they employ.
And then we've got Colin, who says he's sure it's going to be covered as a later date, but as an SME, which most FMB members are, common issue relating to the Act that we come across is that clients do not wish to retain the design team for the build process. This is coming up across the board, Colin, not just for SMEs, mainly due to the cost for the client against a small extension project with a build cost of 50 to 100,000. This restricts the potential workload that can be undertaken. The other main issue we regularly come across is that a lot of subcontractors on our level will struggle to demonstrate their competence as they don't have the full means to do so financially or otherwise. I believe that knowledge for clients and sole traders partnerships is essential.
Initially on the competency thing, all I would say is just remember that this might seem like a really daunting task, but it has to be relative for the works that you are doing.
And that you're asking them to do.
If you are employing a roofing contractor, you know, that's using a traditional felt system, he's been doing it for 25 years, he's got his relevant certification, is approved by the manufacturer, for example, and you've got a statement from him saying that he's got a commitment to technical training, or his work, he's happy for his works to be inspected by a third party. You know, it's relative to them as, you know, and their work. You know, you wouldn't expect that guy to come to you with a 3-year forward CPD plan or a training plan. You know, I wouldn't anyway. I think it has to be very relative to the works for which you're asking them to do.
Yeah.
And that's the key to this is, you know, let's not everybody overreact and say, crikey, we've all got to produce, you know, a 4-year plan and have case studies and write objective appraisals and all the rest of it. Of course, there will be companies that need to do that because they're of the size and complexity where they need to warrant that they can demonstrate that level of competence. There are no standards which say this is how you become a competent organisation.
Yet.
So we have been asked to say that we are competent, but there is not an exam, there is not a list that says if you do X, Y, and Z and evidence it, you are a competent organisation. However, there are competency frameworks and requirements out there for individuals. The competency for organisations is being developed and will be released relatively soon. I don't know exactly, but we're told it's coming. So when you look at the competencies for individuals, they are being used as the benchmark for organisations, and the topics are defined in the documentation that we will refer to later in the webinars. So if you need a reference point to competency, if I want to prove I'm a competent principal contractor, there is a list of things that I need to prove that I am competent at. If I need to prove I'm a competent site supervisor, there's a list of things that I need to say, yes, I've done that, I'm competent in that, I can provide this evidence. So in some ways there is a reference point, but it doesn't specifically exist yet for organisations.
Yeah, Can I jump in there, Mark, and just say that FMB has recently become involved in that work to develop the framework for organisational competence so that we can kind of translate that into something that's practical for our members to use. And out of that, we'd like to be able to develop some checklists and easy ways for members to start thinking about competence of their own workforce and their subcontractors as well, because it's quite hard to start from nothing, isn't it? At least if we have a kind of a checklist that members can use in that way, that should be helpful. So that should be coming members' way soon as well. I've just realised that the time's flipped over to 5 o'clock. So we've had our full hour. There's one last question in there, though, just from Annie asking about if you're the principal contractor on a residential build, are you not then assessing yourself? I'm not sure.
There's inherently there's a level of that anyway, because you know who assesses the assessor. You know, there are in the other sectors client responsibilities to appoint a competent PD and PC. If I'm a principal contractor, it's my responsibility to appoint a competent contractor, and so on with design and subcontractors. So it is a little bit like you are creating and marking your own work, particularly in the domestic market, because you are not going to have a formal appointment by a client. Now, it could be, you know, I would imagine any number of members don't just do domestic, and you will be working with a client that is asking you to prove competency because they have an obligation to do so. So there is a slight distinction with pure domestic and all works, and that's part of the legislation content that will come to in webinar 2.
Right. So thank you so much, Mark and Nicola, for all of that. We will leave it there for today. I'm really looking forward to the follow-on webinars, the rest of the ones in this series, because especially after doing your knowledge check, I thought I knew a fair bit about the Building Safety Act, and now I realise there's quite a bit that I don't know. The next session is on Tuesday the 24th, so a week today at the same time. Please join us if you can. And as I said, you'll receive a follow-up email that goes to everybody who registered, and they will get a link to the recording of the session if they want to watch that back as well. So have a good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. Thanks again, Mark and Nicola.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.